U.S. President Donald Trump has been campaigning in the troubled city of Kenosha, Wisconsin. Trump offered support for police there and accused protesters of spreading what he called domestic terror. Protesters say he's not addressing the country's racial divides. We'll discuss the visit here in the studio after this report.
President Trump arrived in Kenosha on Tuesday with a firm message of law and order. He condemned last week's protests, vowed to help local businesses damaged during the demonstrations, as well as defending and praising law enforcement.
To stop the political violence, we must also confront the radical ideology that includes this violence. Reckless, far-left politicians continue to push the destructive message that our nation and our law enforcement are oppressive or racist. They'll throw out any word that comes to them.
The president's visit prompted more unrest. Trump supporters and Black Lives Matter protesters faced off as he arrived, with members of the black community condemning his visit.
He should just stay where he's at because he's coming down for the wrong reason. He's not coming down here to help. He's coming down here to force the issue with racism. He's not for us. He's not for the country right now, man. Since he became president, my opinion is a lot of doors of racism has opened up.
Kenosha was left partly in ruins following days of violent protests after police shot African-American resident Jacob Blake in the back in late August. Local leaders had urged Trump to stay away to prevent inflaming tensions. Others disagreed.
I feel it's a good time for him to come anytime because he wants to bring comfort and peace to America. And people are hurting right now over all this. And I feel it's a good time for him to come. I support him.
I think the president coming here might make it safer here. Lots of Secret Service. So, for the day. So, but I think tomorrow when he leaves, it might make it worse. So I have mixed feelings.
Wisconsin is a crucial battleground state in the November election. Trump won narrowly here in 2016, and he's determined to keep it Republican as he seeks a second term.
Well, can he do that? To talk about that, I'm joined by DW's U.S. expert, Peter Holadahl. Good morning to you, Peter. Good to see you again. Wisconsin, one of the battleground states, of course, as we just heard there, for Donald Trump. He needs to secure a win there for his election. Was this the right move for him to boost his support in Wisconsin, to show up in Kenosha, support the police?
Well, I think it's a smart move in as far as he's trying to win over or win back, in fact, suburban, particularly white voters, whom he's lost a lot of ground with over the past couple years.
Suburban females being especially
the suburban
critical.
Housewives, yeah, as they like to call them. And his message of kind of fear and carnage and him being the law and order president will restore law and order across America. That's early polling suggested that's actually worked quite well with this particular group. I think we need to this was essentially a campaign stop, right? He has the benefit as the incumbent president of wherever he goes become the national stage. That's a benefit that Joe Biden does not have. And so to be able to go out there, paint this message or in big, bold letters, that can be very effective. I think what we also saw, though, is that Trump, to some extent, blew a hole in the image that his wife, the First Lady Melania Trump, his daughters, including Ivanka Trump, and some of his closest female advisors tried to paint of him, during the convention, of someone who is a great empathizer. Because there was a scene yesterday at a round table where he sat down with two pastors of Jacob Blake's mother, and they were asked about systemic, of whether police brutality was systemic. Rather than letting them finish, he jumped in and pretty much dismissed the question. When he was asked later directly about systemic police violence, he also tried to, cast the blame on the protesters instead, saying that they're essentially responsible for police violence.
He did that in a very clear way. In Kenosha, he said the violent protesters are domestic terrorists.
Yeah.
That's very strong language,
Yeah.
of course. And how does that play, this description of domestic terrorists, the protesters, the violent protesters specifically being domestic terrorists, how does that play into his campaign strategy?
Well, it perfectly aligns with his message, as we've just said. You know, he's trying to paint these as far-left radicals. And I think, it might work with the suburban housewives, for instance. The problem is that if you start comparing his rhetoric to his own actions, you start seeing a contradiction there. He's repeatedly refused to condemn violence, perpetrated by supporters of his. For instance, Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot and killed 2 people during clashes in Kenosha, who is an ardent Trump supporter, turns out.
And he's now on trial.
Who's now on
homicide.
trial. He's also refused to distance himself from QAnon supporters, a conspiracy theory that the FBI has described as a domestic terrorist threat.
Where does this leave Joe Biden? I mean, he's going to have to come up to the plate and somehow address what's happening in American cities.
Yeah, and he's been more sympathetic and taken the sides of the Black Lives Matter protest. Trump and Republicans have tried very hard to paint Joe Biden as someone who's anti-police. The numbers show, though, that Biden would actually, dedicate $300 million to hire more police. He's been very ardent that he condemns the violence that we've seen, that he wants to actually support police in their work.
An important message from him right now.
The question is
to get the Democrats on
he'll
board.
be able to get it through with Trump because Trump has the bigger mic. That is just the case as president.
Peter Holadahl. As ever, Peter, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Let's take this now to our correspondent, Stefan Simon. He's in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Good afternoon to you, Stefan. Trump's visit, very brief there in Kenosha. Did it make a difference on the ground where you are?
It made a difference in terms of that it brought, of course, Trump supporters and anti-Trump protesters basically close together. And they delivered, even if it's now fairly calm, it calmed significantly down, they delivered each other a shouting match and chanting Black Lives Matter, which were then responded with All Lives Matter, which then resulted in more shouting and yelling of Black Lives Matter. It seems to be that, and that is maybe also something the president doesn't understand, that a few people here do not understand, unless Black lives don't matter, it's not the case that all lives matter. So this has to come first, then all lives matter. Having said that, the president characterizing the last week here in Kenosha or today as ravaged by domestic terrorism, that's of course not the case. That is absolutely not the case. Yes, there were protests here. Yes, there was violence here. Yeah, buildings and cars went up in flames. Water bottles were thrown against the police, who answered then with tear gas and rubber bullet and pepper spray. Then, of course, there was also the shooting of a 17-year-old teenager, militia-type vigilante of 2 protesters, which the president in the past actually did only say, well, neutral or good things about. Nothing towards the black community here. No word of condolences, no word of sympathy. No way that people here, the ones we talk to, think that this president came here to unify this town or this country.
Yeah, and Stefan, the White House, despite what you just said there, the White House said that this was a visit to heal and unite. Critics of the president say that it looked more like a campaign stop by a president who's running for re-election. What's your take?
I would agree with this. There is no such thing as the president coming anywhere, doing anything right now, which is not strictly and straight connected to his campaign, to his effort to be re-elected in November. There is no such thing as not being symbolic policy in place here, politics in place here. Everything is a photo op. Everything this president, as well as Mr. Biden and the Democratic campaign does, is linked to the campaign, is linked to being or having the chance of being elected November 3rd. Is this the right thing to do in a time as America as itself hurts, this city hurts, well, that's not for me to answer. There's a lot of people who say, like, we wished all this politics could go away and we actually could focus on the problem, and that is that America has to find a way to solve systemic and structural racism. But, well, I think we got to wait for this a little bit longer.
We got about 1 minute, Stefan. Let me ask you, we've heard the U.S. president compare police shootings to golfers choking on the golf course, missing a golf putt. He seemed to suggest the teenager who killed 2 people with that assault rifle was acting in self-defense. Is the president succeeding in flipping the script on the racial unrest in Kenosha?
I don't think so. And I actually have no words for what he said there. And this imbalance, which is inherently with what he says, is who is going to rationally and logically justify this or actually can follow this? All I can't, and that's just my personal opinion. But I know that from the people I talk to here, they're pretty much along this line. This makes perfect sense for Donald Trump because he is trying to create fear and distrust, division. That's what they say. And I have to say, how he says things, what he said in the last few days regarding Kenosha, it's felt here as exactly that, division.
DW Stefan Simon's on the story for us in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Stefan, thank you. Well, no matter what the White House press secretary or surrogates of the president tell us, President Trump's message has not changed that much over the past 4 years. From Charlottesville to Kenosha, the president has been reluctant to condemn police brutality against black men. He's also been reluctant to condemn violence and provocation from the far right. Most recently in Portland, Oregon, where a pro-Trump caravan descended over the weekend, adding fuel to the already volatile city. The fatal shooting of a Trump supporter only amplified his calls for more law and order. Well, my next guest tonight studies this kind of messaging, especially in right-wing media. I'm happy to welcome Cord Knupfe to the day. Cord teaches political science at the JFK Institute at the Free University here in Berlin. Cord, it's good to have you on the show. Let me start by asking you, what did you think of Trump's visit to Kenosha, Wisconsin today?
Well, I think great to be here, first of all, but I think your correspondent did a fantastic job of summarizing this. And as a political scientist, it's not really up to me to say, to call this good or bad. But I mean, we are faced with the question of what is happening and why. And it's really difficult to find an answer that doesn't end with because Trump is trying to do something that ultimately benefits his campaign.
You know, Trump's language has been supportive of vigilantes, supportive of armed militias. The president has likened police shooting a black man in the back 7 times to a golfer choking on the golf course, as we said. Who are these messages meant for?
Well, I think it's really difficult for some of your viewers, probably sometimes even myself, to really comprehend what the president is talking about every once in a while. And I think in order to really understand what's going on and kind of his messaging, it's important to consider who his base is, but also the type of media that he's catering to. So if your viewers were to follow a different channel, say Fox News, but also certainly social media sites and a vast right-wing kind of media ecosystem that exists in the US, then they would find a very different version of what is going on in these cities. They would find a different version of crime statistics, of threat scenarios. And it's these things that Trump is evoking and he's catering to. He's very much tuned in to these channels himself. And this is the narrative that kind of unfolds. So it's not necessarily enough to just follow what the president is saying. Sometimes we need to consider what this entire kind of news ecosystem, this alternative reality, is conjuring.
That's a very good point. And the news diet that Americans consume, that's important. And as you pointed out, the right-wing media, they love the message that they hear from the president. What about the mainstream media or the non-political, apolitical media, if you will? How have they been handling Trump's messages?
Well, I think mainstream journalism has done a much better job of late in covering Trump. So one of the gravest mistakes that was made early on was just to take, what the president was saying at face value and kind of reporting it, right? To quote whatever Trump was saying. And oftentimes this fell into the trap of reporting on claims, that had no basis in factual reality. But by lending, a New York Times headline to kind of something that the president was saying, this sort of gave it credence. And then that was echoed in other media sources and took on a life of its own. And of late, journalists have become better at calling things that the president is saying outwardly racist, at fact-checking while speeches are ongoing. And I would say they've done a better job. The question, though, remains is if the audience is still tuned in. So whether people that are reading the New York Times or maybe watching this show are actually the ones that are going to end up, still making up their minds in November.
Yeah, that's a good point that you make. If we can reach people who are not in these echo chambers when it comes to media consumption. Trumpism. We know it's not just an American phenomenon. It has jumped across the Atlantic here in Germany. I mean, last weekend here in Berlin, we saw this bizarre mix of neo-Nazis, anti-vaxxers, conspiracy pushers, even retired citizens, all together to protest Germany's coronavirus measures, such as face masks and social distancing. Now, they even tried to storm the Parliament building after they were told that Donald Trump was in Berlin. Watch and listen.
Und Trump ist in Berlin. Die ganze Botschaft ist hermetisch abgeriegelt. Wir haben fast gewonnen. Wir haben fast gewonnen. Wir brauchen Masse. Wir müssen jetzt beweisen, dass wir alle hier sind. Und wir gehen da drauf und holen uns heute, hier und jetzt unser Haus zurück.
Now, that was the speech that was made just moments before people actually tried to storm the Parliament building here in Berlin on Saturday. How did Donald Trump, how did he get to be the great unifier of the disaffected? I mean, he's an icon of conspiracy theorists worldwide. I mean, protesters here in Berlin, they were even carrying the American flag with his photo on it.
Well, I think one thing that's important to stress at this point is that these are still in Germany isolated events. Donald Trump is very unpopular within the German population, and we want to be careful not to kind of overstate the importance of these singular events. That being said, though, I think investigating this question, what drives this, is really important. And again, the media play a crucial role. If you look at, it's not just waving the American flag, there was also iconography pointing towards the conspiracy narrative of QAnon and other such kind of conspiracy theories. And all of this kind of makes a mix for people that are disaffected with the mainstream media narrative, and they look towards people and icons that are outside of this, that are deemed deviant by the mainstream, by mainstream journalism, and then singular, heads of state. A couple of years ago, it might have been Vladimir Putin as well, that speak truth to kind of the lying press, etc. Gain in importance in these circles and are looked to for guidance. So there's a connection here as well with people that are disaffected with mainstream media, that don't trust what they see in established legacy news outlets, and people that are willing to believe kind of these alternative narratives that the president has also actively reinforced.
Yeah, and it's important, as you say, it's perception and it's proportion, too, that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about these stories. Cord Kniss joining us tonight with the JFK Institute here in Berlin. Cord, we appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
Happy to be here. Bye.